In the 250-year history of the United States, 4 presidents have been assassinated while in office. Of these assassinations, 3 are relatively well known. On April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theatre in Washington, D.C. by John Wilkes Booth, an actor and Confederate sympathizer. On September 6, 1901, William McKinley was shot at the Pan-American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, by activist Leon Czolgosz, dying of an infection 8 days later. And on November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas, Texas, by former U.S. Marine Lee Harvey Oswald. The 4th presidential assassination of James Garfield in 1881 is largely forgotten today, though it is, in a way, far more tragic than the others. For the president's drawn-out, agonizing death over 80 days need not have happened at all. It is a strange and sometimes farcical story of a delusional assassin, grossly incompetent doctors, and a famous inventor called in at the 11th hour. James A. Garfield had been president barely 4 months when he set out by carriage to the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C. On that day, July 2nd, 1881, the 54-year-old Civil War veteran was scheduled to travel to Williamstown, Massachusetts to deliver the commencement address at Williams College before starting his summer vacation. One of the worst heat waves in recent memory had descended upon Washington, and Garfield was eager to escape the stifling, malaria-infested capital. He was accompanied by his sons James and Harry, Secretary of State James G. Blaine, and Secretary of War Robert Todd Lincoln, but no bodyguards. This was far from unusual, for with the exception of Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, no president up to that point had traveled with a security detail. And while the Secret Service had been founded in 1865, ironically established by Abraham Lincoln on the day he was shot by Booth, it was still only an anti-counterfeiting organization. Though Garfield may have believed he had not been president long enough to make any enemies, he was about to be proven tragically wrong. At 8:30 a.m., as Garfield crossed the station waiting room, 2 shots rang out. The first bullet grazed Garfield's shoulder, while the second struck him in his lower back, causing him to cry out, "My God, what is that?" and collapse to the floor. Garfield's assassin, one Charles Julius Guiteau, was what one might charitably call eccentric and uncharitably call certifiably cuckoo bananas. Born in 1841 in Freeport, Illinois, Guiteau was savagely beaten by his father, who accused him of wanting things beyond your earnings and being guilty of things that are criminal according to human as well as divine laws. He could not have known how prophetic those words would turn out to be. Guiteau left home in 1857 at the age of 16, and in one of the few strokes of good fortune in his life, he soon inherited $1,000 from his grandfather, about $28,000 today. Determined to put the windfall to good use, Guiteau applied to study law at the University of Michigan, but promptly failed the entrance exam. Guiteau began taking remedial classes in a bid to apply again, but decided instead to join the Oneida Community, a utopian religious organization based in Oneida, New York, whose founder, John Humphrey Noyes, was a personal friend of Guiteau's father. And for more on them, you can see our video, The Cult That Made Your Grandmother's Fine Silverware. While the Oneida's practice of group marriage and free love appealed to Guiteau, his plain appearance and strange behavior led him to being rejected by nearly every woman in the community, earning him the nickname Charles Get Out. He clashed with community leaders, refusing to do his fair share of work, and even drew a chalk line in his room, which he insisted that his roommate not cross. His erratic behavior was summed up in a letter sent to his father by a church official in 1865. He has manifested a decided repugnance to labor with his hands and indeed to business of all kinds, claiming for himself the privileges of a student. He wrote Mr. Noyes a long communication in which he was very insolent, charging him with tyranny and oppression. The truth about the matter is that we consider that there is much evidence of an unsound, insane mind in all this. In his 5 years at Oneida, Guiteau left the community twice. The first time he traveled to Hoboken, New Jersey to found his own Oneida-based newspaper, the Daily Theocrat. When this inevitably failed, he returned to Oneida and tried to sue John Noyes for $9,150 supposedly owed to him for work he had done for the community. But even Guiteau's father sided against him, declaring him insane, and he was forced to flee to Chicago, where he took up a law clerkship and barely passed the bar. In this chapter of his life, Guiteau became an unscrupulous grifter, skimming money off of his clients, sneaking out of boarding houses in the middle of the night to avoid paying the bill, and stealing money from his own family. He was frequently jailed for unpaid debts, his belongings were constantly repossessed by landlords and creditors, and his wife, Annie Bunn, lived in constant fear of retribution at the hands of his legal clients. In 1874, Bunn asked for a divorce, to which Guiteau obliged by sleeping with a prostitute who testified to his infidelity in court. Unfortunately, Guiteau also contracted syphilis, syphilis in the process. His legal career in shambles, Guiteau next tried his hand at being a revival preacher, touring the country, giving rambling, incoherent speeches and charging spectators for the pleasure. As with all his endeavors, this was less than well received, with one newspaper writing, "Is there a hell? 50 deceived people are of the opinion that there ought to be." The man Charles J. Guiteau, if such really is his name, who calls himself an eminent Chicago lawyer, has fraud and imbecility plainly stamped upon his countenance. Although the impudent scoundrel had talked only 15 minutes, he suddenly perorated brilliantly by thanking the audience for their attention and bidding them good night. Before the astounded 50 had recovered from their amazement, he had fled from the building and escaped. Having exhausted his limited talents in 1880, Guiteau moved to Washington, D.C. to pursue his most pathetic venture yet, petitioning politicians in the hopes of winning a political appointment. At the time, the Republican Party was divided into two factions: the stalwarts, who supported President Ulysses S. Grant for a third term, and the half-breeds, who supported Maine Senator James G. Blaine. Deciding he was a loyal stalwart, Guiteau wrote a poorly worded speech in support of Grant, only for Grant to lose the Republican nomination to dark horse candidate James Garfield. Guiteau hastily replaced Grant's name with Garfield's in his speech, but changed literally nothing else, thus attributing to Garfield accomplishments that were clearly Grant's. Guiteau delivered the speech in public only once, and while he had hundreds of printed copies made, failing naturally to pay the printing bill, almost nobody read it. Nonetheless, when Garfield won a narrow victory over Democratic candidate Winfield Hancock, Guiteau became convinced that his speech had been a decisive factor and wrote the president-elect requesting a consular appointment as a reward for his services, stating, "I called to see you this AM, but you were engaged. In October and January last, I sent you a note from New York touching on the Austrian mission. Mr. Carson of Iowa, I understand, wishes to remain at Vienna till fall. He is a good fellow. I do not wish to disturb him in any event. What do you think of me for Consul General at Paris? I think I prefer Paris to Vienna, and if agreeable to you, should be satisfied with the consulship at Paris. Senators Blaine, Logan, and Conklin are friendly to me, and I presume my appointment will be promptly confirmed. I claim to be a gentleman and a Christian." Guiteau spent the winter of 1880 to 1881 loitering around the State Department and the White House, pestering every Republican politician he encountered about the reward supposedly owed him. Having not a penny to his name, Guiteau took up his old habit of sneaking out of boarding houses and grew increasingly slovenly in his appearance, wearing the same tattered clothes day after day. On March the 8th, he finally gained access to the White House and met with President Garfield, handing him a copy of his speech and reminding him of his services to the party. But of course, he heard nothing back. Growing increasingly desperate, Guiteau snuck into a reception and met with First Lady Lucretia Garfield, wrote endless letters to President Garfield and now Secretary of State Blaine, and spent his days loitering in the White House waiting room until the staff finally grew weary of his antics and banned him from the grounds. When on May the 13th the Paris consulship was inevitably awarded to someone else, Guiteau went to the State Department to confront Blaine, only for the secretary to angrily bark, "Never speak to me again on the Paris consulship as long as you live." Enraged at having been cheated of his just reward, Guiteau decided then and there that President Garfield had to die. While most men in Guiteau's position would just have bought a gun and gotten on with the deed, Charles Julius Guiteau was no ordinary assassin. He was determined to carry out the most perfect assassination possible and secure his rightful place in history, and so he began preparing accordingly. Guiteau's first order of business was to obtain a weapon. After borrowing money from a relative, Guiteau purchased a .442 Webley British Bulldog revolver, a box of cartridges, and a penknife for a total of $10. While the ordinary model with the wooden grips was cheaper, Guiteau opted for an ivory-handled example because he thought it would look better when it was eventually displayed in a museum. Knowing nothing about guns, Guiteau spent the next few days familiarizing himself with the weapon's operation, firing a total of 10 practice shots into trees along the banks of the Potomac River. Guiteau next wrote to General William Tecumseh Sherman, commander of the U.S. Army, asking for protection from the mob he assumed would try to lynch him in the wake of the assassination. He also wrote letters to various politicians justifying his act as necessary to unite the factions within the Republican Party. He even visited the District of Columbia jail in order to tour the facility where he was likely to be incarcerated. Finally, in July of 1881, Guiteau was ready to strike. His first opportunity came in late June when President Garfield was seeing his wife, who had contracted malaria, off to a beach resort in New Jersey, but Guiteau decided not to shoot for fear of upsetting her. But a better opportunity would come 2 days later, on July the 2nd, as Garfield prepared to leave for Williamstown. After firing his 2 shots, Guiteau attempted to flee, but collided with policeman and Patrick Kearney, who immediately arrested him. As Guiteau had predicted, the gathering crowd began screaming, "Lynch him!" so Kearney took him away to a police station a few blocks away. As he was being taken into custody, Guiteau cried out, "I'm a stalwart of the stalwarts. I did it, and I want to be arrested. Chester Arthur is president now." Meanwhile, President Garfield lay on the station floor in a pool of blood, conscious but in great pain. As Garfield's regular physician, Jebediah Baxter, was out of town, a replacement was called for, and around an hour later, leading Washington physician Dr. Willard Bliss arrived on the scene. While being shot was bad enough, for Garfield the worst was yet to come, for at the time, germ theory was still not widely accepted among the medical establishment. While pioneering surgeon Joseph Lister had been advocating antiseptic practices like hand washing and spraying with carbolic acid since 1865, his theories were long viewed with great skepticism or even scorn, with the journal The Medical Record writing in 1878, "In order to successfully practice Mr. Lister's antiseptic method, it is necessary that we should believe, or act as if we believed, the atmosphere to be loaded with germs. We are as likely to be much ridiculed in the next century for our blind belief in the power of unseen germs as our forefathers were for their faith in the influence of spirits." Indeed, the presence of pus in a wound, now known to be a dangerous sign of infection, was then seen as a positive sign of healing, while surgeons took pride in the filthy conditions of the operating room, with English surgeon William Savery explaining in 1879 that every surgeon was proud of his old operating coat, which he neither washed nor changed, for the accumulating incrustation of dried blood and pus attested to his experience. Thus, when Dr. Bliss arrived at Garfield's side, his first act was to thrust his unwashed finger into the president's wound to probe for the bullet. Unable to find it, Bliss then gave Garfield a shot of morphine, which immediately caused him to vomit. After ordering the president carried to the upper floor of the train station, Bliss once again tried to locate the bullet using a metal probe, but this time became stuck in the shattered remains of Garfield's 11th rib and was only removed with great difficulty. Bliss then called for the assistance of local physician Dr. Robert Rayburn, who, believing the shooting to be a prank, took some time to arrive. In fact, he was the 10th of a total of 16 doctors to rush to the president's side. With the bullet still eluding location at 5:30 p.m., it was decided to move Garfield back to the White House. There, in an attempt to alleviate the oppressive heat, special ventilators were installed by the Navy to pump in cool air from the basement. Garfield was also given glasses of chilled champagne, but he promptly threw these up. He continued to throw up every half hour until the following morning, while the 16 attending doctors took turns thrusting their dirty fingers into the wound. Navy Surgeon General Philip Wales probed the wound and concluded that the bullet had penetrated Garfield's liver, when in fact Wales himself had punched a false wound channel through the organ, which soon became infected and filled with pus. At the same time, a new conflict erupted as Garfield's regular physician, Jebediah Baxter, arrived at the scene. At the time, the medical community was divided into two main factions: allopaths and homeopaths. Allopaths believed in heroic measures such as invasive surgery, while homeopaths believed in various forms of quackery, including phrenology, the measuring of bumps on a person's skull, hypnosis, and the dilution of herbs and drugs to nearly undetectable concentrations. Baxter was a homeopath, while Bliss was an allopath, and a heated argument between the two men spiraled into a literal fistfight. Baxter backed down and promptly left the White House, never to see Garfield again. Meanwhile, the assassination caused a sensation in the press, with medical columnists with names like Medicus, Old Practitioner, and Common Sense recommending various bizarre cures like hanging the president upside down to allow the bullet to fall out, or removing the bullet using a rubber tube attached to an air pump. Others sent telegrams suggesting various creative punishments for Garfield's assassin, Charles Guiteau. One advocated forcing Guiteau to eat 2 ounces of flesh every day, while another enclosed a dozen bedbugs to be placed in Guiteau's prison bed. While most of these crank letters were ignored, there was one man who did seem to offer a viable solution: Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone. Upon learning of the shooting, Bell rushed from his home in Boston to Washington's Volta laboratory. While developing a device called an induction balance to help cancel out interference in telephone lines, Bell discovered that the instrument was strongly affected by nearby pieces of metal and suggested it might be used to detect mineral deposits in the ground. Now, along with associate Sumner Tainter, Bell set about developing the induction balance into an instrument that could detect the bullet embedded in the president's body. For 3 weeks, Bell and Tainter worked every day and night perfecting the device until finally they were able to detect lead bullets fired into slabs of beef. On July 26, 1886, Bell and Tainter arrived at the White House and were admitted to the president's bedroom. By this time, the president's condition had seriously deteriorated. The incessant probing by the doctor's dirty fingers had turned what was once a small 3-inch deep wound into a 20-inch long infected trench stretching from his ribs to his his groin and oozing copious amounts of foul-smelling pus. Garfield was racked with searing fevers and delirium, and his weight dropped from 210 to 130 pounds. In the presence of 5 attending physicians, Bell slowly passed the metal detector coil over the president's body. Garfield, wary of electrocution, remained tense throughout, eyeing Bell suspiciously. The detector produced only a few indistinct clicks, forcing Bell to cut the experiment short. He and Tainter returned to their laboratory to improve the device, returning to the White House 5 days later. This time, however, the metal detector produced only a loud, persistent hum, and Bell was once again unable to locate the bullet. It later turned out that despite Bell's request, the White House staff had failed to remove the metal bed springs from Garfield's bed, and these had interfered with the instruments. Furthermore, on Bell's first attempt, Dr. Bliss had only allowed him to scan Garfield's right side, which was where he believed the bullet to be. Bell later concluded that his metal detector worked perfectly, and that had he been able to scan the president's left side, he would have easily found the bullet. While Bell's innovation gathered considerable attention from the press, in typical fashion, Bell quickly lost interest and moved on to other projects. But a physician named Dr. John Gerdner developed Bell's metal detector into a practical medical device which was successfully used during the Sino-Japanese, Boer, and First World Wars to detect bullets and shrapnel embedded in soldiers' bodies. In 1886, the University of Heidelberg even awarded Bell an honorary doctorate for his inadvertent contribution to battlefield medicine. Meanwhile, Garfield's condition seemed to improve. His fever dropped and he was able to hold food and drink down, and on July the 29th he met with his cabinet for the first and only time during his illness. By August, however, the Washington heat and humidity was proving unbearable, so the decision was made to move the president to a cooler climate to aid in his recovery. British aristocrat Charles Franklin offered the use of his opulent cottage in Elberon, New Jersey, and a special spur line was built overnight to transport Garfield there. The president arrived at Franklin Cottage on September the 6th and was propped up on a bed with a view of the ocean. Yet despite his apparent recovery, Garfield's condition began to deteriorate once more. Soon he was unable to digest solid food, and his doctors took to administering nutrient enemas consisting of eggs, bouillon, milk, whiskey, and opium to stave off further weight loss. But by then the infection had spread all over Garfield's body. His right eye swelled shut and pus ran from all his orifices, forcing doctors to make incisions to his face to help with drainage. Finally, on September the 19th, 1881, at 10:35 p.m., President James A. Garfield died of a combination of sepsis, pneumonia, and an aneurysm in his spleen. Just before he expired, his wife Lucretia kissed his brow and exclaimed, "Oh, why am I made to suffer this cruel wrong?" Vice President Chester Arthur received the news of Garfield's death later that evening and was inaugurated as president early the next morning. Garfield's body was taken back to Washington and laid in state for 2 days in the Capitol building before being buried in Cleveland, Ohio on September the 26th, 1881. During the 79 days between the shooting and his death, Garfield had carried out only one official act as president, requesting the extradition of a forger who had escaped to Canada. An autopsy later revealed that the bullet had lodged itself harmlessly in the hard tissue surrounding Garfield's lower spine, meaning, ironically, that had his doctors simply bandaged the wound and left it alone, Garfield would likely have survived the shooting, as the Journal the Medical Counselor later concluded. Summing up the case from an allopathic standpoint, the man is ignorantly or willfully blind who fails to see that President Garfield's case has been the most grossly mismanaged case in modern history, and his surgeons are guilty of a deliberate attempt to throw the burden of a glaring incompetence upon Providence rather than leave it where it justly belongs. And if you think the 16 physicians who flocked to Garfield's bedside were simply doing their patriotic duty, then you'd be wrong, for they immediately submitted a bill of $85,000 to the United States Senate, about $280,000 today, for services rendered. The indignant Senate approved a payment of only $10,000, angrily dismissing the doctors as incompetent quacks. Meanwhile, Garfield's assassin, Charles Guiteau, carried on being, well, Charles Guiteau. When a reporter came to sketch him shortly after his arrest, Guiteau tried to charge him royalties for the privilege. Oblivious to the public's hatred of him and convinced he would be acquitted, he began planning a public speaking tour after his release and even to run for president in 1884. When his trial began in November 1881, Guiteau's courtroom antics were even more outrageous, the assassin constantly insulting and bickering with his defense team with such gems as, "You are about as consummate a jackass, I must say, as I ever saw. I would rather have some 10-year-old boy try this case than you. I could have got 3 or 4 first-class lawyers on this case that were anxious to come if you hadn't elbowed them off with your consummate egoism and vanity." Guiteau also frequently broke out into religious songs, delivered his testimony in the form of epic poems, solicited money and legal advice from spectators, and even dictated an autobiography to a newspaper complete with an ad for a wife, as you do. Throughout the trial, Guiteau insisted that he was merely an instrument of God, and that Garfield's death was either an act of providence or the fault of his doctors, and to be fair, he kind of had a point with that one. He also claims that while he was legally insane at the time of shooting, he was not medically insane, a bizarre statement that caused much confusion among his defense team. Indeed, his was among the first high-profile trials in United States history to prominently feature the insanity defense. Unsurprisingly, Guiteau's arguments failed to convince the jury, and on January 25th, 1882, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Eccentric and delusional to the last, Guiteau requested that during his execution he be allowed to recite a poem he had written entitled "I Am Going to the Lordy," while an orchestra played in the background. While he was denied the orchestra, on June 30th, 1882, Guiteau danced up the stairs to the gallows, shook hands with the executioner, and recited his poem. Then, as agreed beforehand, he dropped the paper to signal his readiness and dropped through the trapdoor to his death. His family being unable to afford a funeral, Guiteau's body was instead dissected and his brain preserved so that it could be studied. It remains on display at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. Though the assassination of James Garfield revealed a number of glaring flaws in how safely the authority of the president was maintained, these would not be meaningfully addressed until many decades later. For instance, it would not be until the assassination of William McKinley in 1901 that the Secret Service would be given its modern task of ensuring the safety of the president. Nor was the problem of succession in the event of the president's incapacity addressed until 1967, when the 25th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, granting official authority to the vice president if the president is deemed incapable of executing the duties of their office. While it is perhaps inappropriate to make light of such grim events, it cannot be denied that the combination of bad luck, missed opportunities, criminal incompetence, and sheer insanity make the death of James Garfield one of the most farcical and tragicomic assassinations in history. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.